The date was August 23rd, 1305, and the streets of London echoed with the roar of a bloodthirsty crowd gathered to witness one of history's most notorious executions. They had come to watch the death of William Wallace, the Scottish knight who dared to challenge the English crown. What happened that day was not merely an execution, but a meticulously planned spectacle of cruelty designed to destroy a man and the symbol he represented. The popular imagination, shaped by Hollywood films and romantic stories, has almost reduced Wallace's final moments to a noble situation. The reality, however, was far more horrific and unimaginably cruel. King Edward I, known as Longshanks, had designed Wallace's punishment not merely as retaliation, but as a message that would resonate for generations. So how did the hope of a nation turn into such a horrific spectacle in the middle of a city? To find the answer to this question, we must go back 35 years, to the days when Scotland still knew peace. The year was 1270. In the lush hills of Renfrew, a child was born to a small landowner. They named him William, and no one could have predicted that this baby would one day stand against Europe's most powerful king. Young William grew up in the shadow of the Scottish Highlands, becoming a tall and strong man. He learned to read and write, luxuries for many men of his station, studied Latin with priests, and developed a mind as sharp as a sword. But what truly stood out was his physical strength. By the time he reached 20, William Wallace was a giant of a man, standing nearly 1.98 meters tall. His shoulders were broad enough to carry the hopes of a nation, and his hands were strong enough to wield an 1.8-meter sword with deadly skill. Scotland in William's youth was a peaceful land ruled with wisdom and strength by King Alexander III. However, in a cruel twist of fate, Alexander III fell from his horse into a ravine and died in 1286. With his death, Scotland's golden age came to an end. The throne passed to Margaret of Norway, a 3-year-old child who had never set foot in Scotland before. For 4 years, the country was in turmoil, ruled by regents, and in 1290, with Margaret's death, Scotland was left without a king to rule it. It was precisely at this point that King Edward I of England, known as Longshanks, saw this northern struggle for the throne as an opportunity to further his own ambitions. When the Scottish nobles invited him as a mediator to prevent civil war, they were unaware that they were actually paving the way for the wolf. Edward chose John Balliol, a weak man he could control, like a puppet, as king. However, Edward's ambition did not stop there. He demanded that Scottish nobles swear direct allegiance to him, that Scottish legal disputes be brought before English courts, and that Scottish knights serve in his wars. These demands were a noose around Scotland's neck. In 1296, Edward's armies swept across the Scottish border like a swarm of locusts. The first town they encountered, Berwick upon Tweed, became a brutal testament to English fury. Edward's soldiers not only defeated the defenders, but slaughtered every living soul they could find. Men, women, children, even babies, suckling at their mothers' breasts, fell under the British sword. Chroniclers wrote that the rivers ran red with blood, and corpses were piled high. In a single day, 17,000 people were killed, simply for being born on the wrong side. Young William Wallace bore silent witness to all this horror. As Edward deposed Balliol and proclaimed himself ruler of Scotland, Wallace was filled with rage. When the English administrators distributed Scottish lands to their supporters, something fundamental broke inside Wallace. The spark that ignited Wallace's rebellion came in May 1297. Like many moments that changed history, it began with a small, personal event. Although the exact details have been lost over time, when William Wallace drew his sword on William Heselrigg, the English sheriff of Lanark, he had crossed a line of no return. Heselrigg's murder sent shockwaves through occupied Scotland. Finally, there was someone willing to shed English blood. This man looked at Edward I's seemingly invincible war machine and said, "Enough is enough." The murder of William Heselrigg sparked the first flame of a resistance movement. which quickly spread like wildfire across Scotland. As news of the event spread from village to village by word of mouth, Wallace's act became a symbol of courage. He was no longer just a fugitive. He was a beacon of hope for a people who had lost all hope. Under his leadership, people determined to resist the occupation began to unite from the mountains and forests of Scotland. They were all ordinary people, tired of English oppression, farmers, peasants, and small landowners who lived like strangers on their own land. This rebellion was not a war led by the nobility, but a struggle initiated by the people for their own freedom. Meanwhile, in a different corner of Scotland, the noble leader, Andrew de Moor, had also raised the banner of rebellion. He and Wallace were fighting for the same cause, unaware of each other. As fate would have it, these two great Scottish heroes would be united on the same path. King Edward I of England was slowly beginning to grasp the seriousness of this unexpected wave of resistance. The experienced commanders he sent to control Scotland were helpless against Wallace's guerrilla tactics. Wallace was much faster and smarter than his enemy. He raided English supply lines, launched sudden attacks with small groups, and then vanished without a trace into the depths of the Scottish Highlands. He and his men knew their own terrain so well that they had turned this geography into an ally, a weapon. This tactical superiority weakened the English and undermined their morale. In September 1297, these two opposing forces clashed at Stirling Bridge, one of Scotland's most critical points. The English army, led by commanders John de Warenne and Hugh de Cressingham, was a massive force consisting of 300 cavalry and 10,000 infantry. Opposing them was a Scottish army that was vastly outnumbered, but filled with determination and courage. Wallace and Moray had devised a clever plan. They would wait for the English army to cross the narrow Stirling Bridge, and then ambush those who crossed to the other side, eliminating them one by one. This plan was their only chance to capture Stirling Castle, and could determine the fate of Scotland. The English did not take Scotland's resistance seriously. Sir Hugh de Cressingham did not want to waste time, and insisted on crossing the narrow bridge immediately. However, his arrogance would be his undoing. Early in the morning, a group of English knights began crossing the bridge in the fog. They were followed by the main body of English infantry. As the English advanced, the number of Scottish warriors gathering on the Scottish side of the bridge increased. The tension between the two armies was palpable. Wallace and Moray waited for the right moment. After a significant portion of the English forces had crossed the bridge, Wallace gave the order, "Now." At that moment, the Scottish warriors sprang into action to write their own historic victory. On the narrow bridge, it was impossible for the heavily armored English cavalry and infantry to move. Their horses panicked, and the knights were trapped in the confined space. Wallace's army began to pierce the English ranks, using 18-foot-long spears. It was like building a wall against them. Amidst sword blows and arrow fire, the Scots completely halted the English advance. Panicked English soldiers caused a bottleneck on the bridge, and those behind began pushing those in front toward the river. This was not just a battle, but a massacre. The river ran red with blood, the screams of drowning soldiers mingling with the din of battle. After capturing Stirling Bridge, the Scots watched as the remaining English army retreated. The price of victory had been heavy. Andrew de Moor had been seriously wounded in battle, and would later die from his injuries. However, the victory had once again given Scotland hope for freedom. Wallace was proclaimed protector of Scotland following this victory. The myth of English invincibility had been shattered. He was no longer just a rebel, but a national hero. The battle at Stirling Bridge became a turning point in Scotland's struggle for independence and etched William Wallace's name in history in golden letters. The victory at Stirling Bridge transformed William Wallace from an ordinary rebel into a national hero. The myth of English invincibility was shattered, and following this victory, Wallace was proclaimed protector of Scotland. This title was proof that he was seen not only as a warrior, but also as the true leader of the country. However, This new status made him the target of jealousy and distrust among the Scottish nobility. To them, Wallace was a folk hero, but also a leader who threatened their interests because he was not of noble birth. This internal conflict would weaken Scotland's resistance from within. King Edward I of England was furious after the disastrous defeat at Stirling. He gathered his own army and personally commanded his largest force to secure complete control over Scotland. In July 1298, the two armies faced off near Falkirk. Wallace's army was vastly outnumbered and weakened by the lack of support from the nobility. The battle at Falkirk was the complete opposite of the victory at Stirling. The English longbowmen left the Scottish infantry defenseless. Wallace's army was routed, and the English army won the victory, aided by the betrayal of some Scottish nobles who did not participate in the battle themselves. This heavy defeat shook Wallace's position and forced him to resign from his title of guardian. This was his first and last defeat as a folk hero. However, he did not give up. In the years that followed, Wallace continued his diplomatic efforts for Scottish independence. He traveled to France and Rome, seeking support from other kingdoms. However, his efforts were in vain. When he returned to Scotland, the lands that had once hailed him as a hero had now become a hunting ground for him. King Edward I had placed a large bounty on Wallace's capture. After years of pursuit, on August 5, 1305, Wallace was betrayed by one of his closest associates, the Scottish knight, John de Menteith. Menteith captured Wallace near Glasgow and handed him over to the English. Wallace was taken to London in chains. The date was August 23, 1305. He was tried for treason and rebellion. However, this was more of a spectacle than a legal process. Wallace tried to defend himself, but could not make himself heard. He was informed that he was accused of rebelling against King Edward. Wallace replied, "I am no traitor, for I am not Edward's subject." This was proof of his honorable stance, which he maintained until the end of his life. But this defense was meaningless. The decision had already been made. He was sentenced to the most horrific punishment, death by hanging, drawing, and quartering for treason. The execution was carried out in plain view of everyone in London's Smithfield district. Wallace was dragged by a horse over a barrier to the place of execution. He was then hanged, but taken down before he was completely dead. While still alive, he was castrated, his intestines were cut out, and his internal organs were burned. Finally, his head was cut off, and his body was quartered. Contrary to Hollywood films and romantic stories, Wallace's final moments were not a noble death, but a torture filled with unimaginable cruelty. King Edward's aim was not just to kill Wallace, but to completely destroy him and everything he represented. The pieces of Wallace's body were sent to cities across England and displayed in public places to ensure that no one would ever dare to rebel again. Wallace's body was torn apart, but his spirit and the ideas he represented could never be destroyed. His death took root like a seed in the heart of a nation. Edward thought he had succeeded in destroying Wallace, but in fact he had turned his death into a prophecy. Wallace's body was scattered across the lands he had fought for, but this brutal execution only inflamed Scottish resistance. Wallace's story spread through whispers, forbidden songs, and secret prayers, passed down from generation to generation. And finally, a few years later, Scottish leaders like Robert the Bruce took up his legacy, continuing the war against the English and achieving a decisive victory at Bannockburn in 1314. Wallace's tragic death became an inspiration for Scottish independence, and his name went down in history as one of the greatest national heroes of all time.